When a Tucson, Arizona teen vanishes from her home while her mom is at work, evidence suggests that she was abducted. Her body is located on the outskirts of town the following morning, prompting a homicide investigation that remains open decades later in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott, and I have a confession before we start. I do know a little bit about this case, but we'll find out more about that in a minute.
A quick heads up, this episode contains discussion of sexual assault. Please listen with care. Margaret Carabetta was last seen alive on April 8, 1982. She was 15 years old at the time and lived with her mom in Tucson, Arizona. Margaret was a sophomore at Saguaro High School, and according to those who knew her, she had a well-balanced personality that was complemented by an enthusiasm for life. She was on the quiet side, but still friendly. She was introspective, yet self-confident, and squared away, as the dean of her high school put it. She wasn't a standout student, but she still enjoyed school for the most part. In short, she was a down-to-earth girl who was really beginning to look forward to the future. She was just a few short years from adulthood and was increasingly excited about what the world had to offer. Margaret's mom, Judy, summed her daughter up when she told the Arizona Daily Star, quote, "She really liked herself. She didn't like anything more than being alive," end quote. Margaret lived with just her mom. Her parents had recently divorced, which had been hard on her. When they'd split, Judy had moved out of her former family home and into a new house, and Margaret had gone with her. Margaret did have a sibling, a brother, but to the best of my knowledge, he wasn't living with her and her mom, at least not at the time that this all occurred. In any case, the move had put Margaret in a new school district, but she hadn't wanted to switch schools. All her friends were at Saguaro, and having to start over at a new school would have been a pretty serious blow at that age. Margaret's parents knew the divorce had been hard enough on her already and didn't want to compound her problems. So they worked out an agreement. Margaret would live with her mom physically, but would retain her dad's address on paper. That way, she didn't have to switch schools. So that was the arrangement, and it seemed to be working out pretty well. Every morning, Judy drove Margaret to school. Later in the day, Judy would head to work. She worked at a bar, which required late shifts. By the time Judy left for work on the day of Margaret's disappearance, Margaret was already home from school. Judy drove a convertible, and as she prepared to leave for her shift, she decided she wanted to drive with the top up that day. So she asked Margaret to help her. According to an article by Heather Urquidez for the Arizona Daily Star, Margaret, in typical teenage fashion, seemed kind of annoyed by the request. However, she did help, and as she made her way into the house, her mom called out, quote, "Hey, give me one more look." End quote. That was a line from an old movie that they both loved, A Star is Born, so it was kind of an inside joke. And as Margaret disappeared inside the house, she laughed. And that was the last time that Judy ever saw her. Like many girls her age, Margaret had recently begun dating, which was a source of much excitement. She had a boyfriend who came over to visit that night. They hung out for a while until about 11 o'clock. At that point, a friend picked him up, and Margaret, alone again, proceeded to get ready for bed. Judy did call to check on her daughter that night at some point between 10:30 and 11 p.m. At that time, Margaret was fine, and there was nothing to indicate that the conversation would be their last. However, at some point after the phone call, things went terribly wrong. A predator, who remains nameless to this day, moved in, taking Margaret out of her home and out of her family and friends' lives forever. Her mom discovered her absence at about 1:30 a.m. when she arrived home from her shift at the bar. Right away, it was obvious that something was wrong. The front door was ajar despite the late hour, and on top of that, their dog was out of the house, running around totally unleashed and unsupervised. Judy rushed inside the house and checked every room for her daughter, but she was nowhere to be found. Naturally, she called 911, but Scott, I bet you can guess what kind of response she got when she tried to report her daughter missing.
Was it she has to be missing for 24 hours before we'll take a report?
Yes, that's exactly right. The officer she spoke with told her that she couldn't report her 15-year-old daughter missing until she'd been unaccounted for 24 whole hours.
As I say so frequently, the first 48 are crucial. There's TV shows. I can't go on enough about how important those hours are. And of those first 48, the first 24 are even more so. They're crucial.
Yeah, definitely.
So making a parent wait for 24 hours with a missing child when you have plenty of evidence saying, hey, something isn't right here, like a door being ajar, a dog running around, those are all indicators that, hey, maybe even if you have this 24-hour policy, you should escalate this.
Definitely. We hear about this a lot, unfortunately, especially with older cases. So the officer that Judy spoke to, he told her that all she could do, her only option was to report her daughter as a runaway, which, by the way, would not result in a search like a missing report would.
It doesn't even sound like they wanted to come out and see if the door had been forced open.
No, they didn't. So naturally and rightfully, Judy was mad. The idea of Margaret running away was virtually inconceivable. She was, after all, the kind of kid whose dean at school described them as squared away. No one who knew Margaret would have entertained the idea of her running away from home. It just wasn't in her character. And yet, claiming that she had done so was the only option local police even offered Judy. She was disgusted and refused to label her daughter a runaway. After all, what would be the point? It wasn't like that was going to prompt officers to get out there and search for her. So she was left with no choice but to wait 24 hours for police assistance. Meanwhile, knowing that police wouldn't be any help until the following night, Judy immediately took matters into her own hands. Scott, she was probably exhausted after a late-night shift on her feet at the bar where she worked, but in the blink of an eye, that no longer mattered. All Judy cared about was finding Margaret. She desperately searched the neighborhood herself and began calling friends, anyone she could think of, waking them up to see whether they knew where Margaret was. Unfortunately, none of them did. Also extremely unfortunate, Scott, is the fact that just hours later, well before 24 hours had passed, Margaret's body was found. At about 8 a.m. the following morning, according to an article for Tucson.com, two elderly women out for a walk discovered Margaret's body about 4.5 miles, or approximately 7.2 kilometers, away from her home. Quick side note here. Investigators would eventually learn that a young couple had seen Margaret's body hours earlier when it was still night, but had fled the area and had been too scared to immediately report what they'd seen. When they eventually did come forward and tell police that they'd seen her, though, that helped investigators narrow down a window of time for her death, so it was still helpful.
When you're a young couple, you're thrust into this situation that you're really not sure about, and
right.
The police have this attitude that they had. They probably would have been very concerned that they would have been the primary suspect and treated like they were guilty of this.
Maybe. Since they were kids, it could have been as simple as the fact that their parents may not have known they were out there at the edge of town at night. Maybe they weren't supposed to be out. But in any case, they did eventually come forward. Anyway, Margaret and her mom lived in a house on North Woodland Avenue, in the area where Margaret's body was found at the intersection of North Craycroft Road and East Pinchot Road is just a short drive away, less than 10 minutes. In order to get from the house to the secondary location, one simply has to make 2 immediate left turns and then drive down North Craycroft Road. At that point, it's a straight shot to the area where the edge of Tucson bleeds into the Catalina Foothills. And you know this already, Scott, because you and I made the drive to see for ourselves.
We did. We had discussed it briefly. We happened to be in Arizona, and we're going to be passing through Tucson and decided to make this trip.
Right. I kind of had to disclose to you that this was a location where a victim's body was found. Otherwise, it would have been really weird.
I mean, we were right there at the intersection. We stopped, we looked around, and it is very secluded.
Right. We figured why not see for ourselves. So, as you know, Scott, those foothills are home to a wealthy neighborhood. It's a really beautiful place, and today it's home to expansive homes and some luxury spas, each buffered by generous grounds, which really preserve the feel of open space.
They really did, and it didn't surprise me that in the early hours, 2 ladies walking were the ones to find it, because while we were stopped there, we happened across multiple couples and individuals just walking through the area.
Yeah, and some older women jogging. It looks like it's very typical for the neighborhood. We were there in the morning, and there was a lot of it going on.
Yep, it made perfect sense.
And usually, seeing women, especially older women, jogging alone is a green flag. It's an indication that you're usually in a pretty safe neighborhood.
Yeah, everybody seemed pretty calm and just relaxed. They weren't alarmed that two people were stopped on the side of the road walking around, and one of them happened to be picking off prickly pears and getting thorns stuck in their thumb.
Well, you're kind of incapacitating yourself, so you weren't really much of a threat, but it holds true in that area. It's generally very safe there. Statistically speaking, crime is rare. Back in 1982, at the time of Margaret's death, the location, the intersection of North Craycroft and East Pinchot, was locally known as a lover's lane. That is, somewhere where couples, particularly young couples like the ones who originally found the body, could drive to for some privacy. In comparison to the neat residential grid of middle or working class houses closely spaced together in the neighborhood where Margaret lived, the Craycroft and Pinchot intersection area is sparsely developed with generous amounts of open space and more desert scrub, brush, trees, and cacti than buildings. And that's speaking in today's terms. Back in the 80s, it was probably even less developed.
I can really see the remote and seclusion, and it provides the opportunity to do this with some level of privacy.
Yeah, having seen the place for myself, it doesn't surprise me that the area was known that way among young couples. Basically, for anyone living in the area where Margaret did, if they wanted to make a quick getaway to somewhere less densely populated, driving up Craycroft to the Catalina Foothills would serve as a quick and logical escape.
Like you said, it's only 10 minutes from our house. It's not like you're going on this massive trek across the city.
Right. Now, of course, the same thing that could potentially have made the location appealing to young couples could potentially make it appealing to someone with criminal intent. Now, none of the articles I read during the course of my research specifically say that Margaret was killed at the place where her body was found. However, they do say that there were no signs of violence or a struggle at her home, and a third location has never been publicly mentioned or hinted at in relation to her case. Additionally, we know that Margaret was fatally beaten with a rock, which was likely a weapon of opportunity that her killer picked up from the ground at the scene of the crime. Therefore, I assume that Margaret was likely killed in the very place where her body was found hours later. So, it was there, at the intersection of two roads on the scenic outskirts of town, that those two women stumbled upon Margaret's body. And it was likely there that she'd been killed as well. Her killer had left her partially clothed, face down in the dirt. Her hands had been tied behind her back, and it was clear that her death had been a homicide. When investigators arrived on scene, summoned by the women who'd discovered Margaret's body, they determined that Margaret's cause of death had been blunt force trauma. She'd been beaten to death with a blunt object, specifically that rock that I mentioned. Early newspaper articles stated only that she'd been struck with a blunt object, but ones from a little later revealed that the object had been a rock. And her cause of death was, of course, later confirmed by a medical examiner. As for Margaret's state of partial undress, she was found wearing a t-shirt and a pair of underwear, nothing else. And those garments were determined to be something that she would normally wear to bed, so Scott, to be clear, it is not believed that her killer undressed her. The t-shirt and underwear are believed to be exactly what she'd been wearing when she'd been taken from her home. Furthermore, according to an article by Jay Gonzalez for the Arizona Daily Star, the medical examiner found no signs of sexual assault when examining Margaret's body, which, to be honest, surprised me a little.
Yeah, so far, all of that has been surprising because I would have expected it to be some sort of sexual assault or sexually motivated crime.
When you hear about a young woman's discarded body found in a partial state of undress with her hands tied behind her back, there's almost always sexual assault involved. Now, I would be remiss not to mention that the fact that there were no physical signs of sexual assault does not necessarily rule out the possibility of a sexually motivated homicide. I say this because when it comes to killers who commit sexually motivated homicide, there are different types. Some may derive sexual satisfaction from murder without performing any acts of penetrative assault upon the victim. So, in this case, the possibility of a sexual motive can't be ruled out. Additionally, and perhaps more likely in this case, there also exists the possibility that Margaret's killer had intended to sexually assault her, but had been interrupted or spooked or hadn't carried out the intended assault for some other reason. What can be ruled out, motive-wise, is robbery. Nothing was taken from the Carabetta home, no material possessions or valuables, only Margaret herself. The question is, of course, who would want to kill Margaret and why? She was a down-to-earth, likable 15-year-old girl with no known enemies. In the wake of her murder, her mom, Judy, was, naturally, rightfully furious with the local police, who'd refused to allow her to report her missing. After Margaret's body was found, police, of course, became involved. However, their investigative efforts have never produced a definitive suspect. Now, that's not to say that they haven't looked at and interviewed any potential suspects. They definitely have. But no one has ever been charged in relation to Margaret's murder. Now, we know that there were at least a couple of people who knew Margaret was home alone on the night of her death. Her boyfriend and his friend who picked him up from Margaret's house that night, for starters. I strongly suspect that they both are among the unnamed people who investigators say they've investigated, although they've never specifically publicly named them. And of course, there may have been others who knew that Margaret was there alone as well. Neighbors, friends, acquaintances, etc. In a case with no clear suspect, all sorts of people must be considered. Investigators believe that whoever killed Margaret knocked on the door and that Margaret answered the door in her night clothes. If true, this might indicate that Margaret's killer was someone she knew and that she opened the house's front door to them and greeted them in her night clothes voluntarily. Most reporting on Margaret's case intimates that this was the case. However, I suspect that there's another possibility, the possibility that Margaret was expecting to open the door to someone else, someone who she knew well and wouldn't have hesitated to open the door for, even in her night clothes. I'm talking, of course, about her mom. Margaret's mom, Judy, arrived home that night not long after Margaret was taken from the house. If Margaret had heard a knock at the door, she might have assumed it was her mom coming home from work. Remember, this was in 1982, so it was before someone would be able to fire off a text saying, "Hey, on my way home."
Yeah.
Now, Scott, I don't know whether Judy usually got home from work at the same time every night or whether it varied. I do know from my own past experience working in bars, though, that bar and restaurant staff rarely get home at the same time every night. So Judy's typical time of arrival each night may have varied, and like I said, firing off a text wasn't an option.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it was like in 1982's Tucson, but a Thursday night, kind of in that midweek rush, it could be a slow night potentially.
It's very possible. Now, Scott, I could be wrong, but I suspect that the number of people who a 15-year-old girl would open the door for while home alone in the middle of the night while pantsless would be pretty limited. We can probably safely assume that regardless of whether or not Margaret knew her killer, when she opened the front door, she was probably expecting to see someone she knew. Possibly her mom or even her boyfriend, but likely not a stranger.
It feels like somebody that was probably watching and knew her routine to some level of confidence, though.
Right. Yeah, I could see that. Maybe somebody who lived in the neighborhood and noticed her mom had gone to work, her boyfriend had left, Now, as for who was really on the other side of the door, well, chances are strong that they were someone she knew. As we often mention on this show, statistically speaking, most women and girls who are murdered are killed by someone they know, often a man in their lives. The possibility that she unknowingly opened the door to a stranger also exists, but is, statistically speaking, less likely. In any case, at some point, a deputy came up with a theory regarding Margaret's murder. Now, Scott, I want to preface this by saying I don't know how the deputy arrived at this theory, but they postulated that Margaret's killer had been someone she'd known and that they had been a, quote, spurned lover, end quote.
Do we know when he came up with this theory?
Back in the 80s.
I could see that coming out of a deputy. It feels like an old, just easy cop theory to me.
It does. It's got a very 80s vibe. I'm not crazy about it, but the deputy even theorized that Margaret may have left willingly with her killer. However, I personally find that aspect of the theory very difficult to swallow, considering how she was dressed, or rather, not dressed, for starters. It seems unlikely to me that Margaret would have been willing to walk outside and climb into her killer's vehicle and go somewhere while not wearing pants, even if they were someone she knew and trusted.
The other glaring and obvious marker against that is the fact that why wouldn't she have closed the door behind her?
Right, that's the biggest thing for me. There was no way that she would have voluntarily left the front door wide open, air conditioning the whole neighborhood, as a parent would say, and letting their dog get loose where he could be at risk of being hit by a car or who knows what else.
Yeah, that's not something that a teenager that loves their pet would do.
No, I don't think she would do that at all. Plus, I also don't think she sounds like the kind of kid who would willingly terrify their mom. If she was going somewhere, she knew that her mom would be getting home from work soon and that she would be expecting her to be there. That does not sound like the squared away, thoughtful teenager who's been described to us.
No, the only thing I can think of in relation to that would really be a positive for that theory is the location of the body being somewhere that the killer probably idolized being with her and taking her to that lover's lane. That's the only way I could really see that coming about.
Right, but the physical signs suggest that she did not leave willingly with them.
Exactly.
So that tells me that when she opened the front door, if she did, as investigators believe, the person or persons on the other side abducted her, taking her away from the house either with immediate physical force or by forcing her to comply via threats. For example, she may have opened the door and been confronted by someone holding a weapon. From there, Margaret's killer transported her to the Catalina Foothills. Scott, that deputy's theory suggests that Margaret's killer took her life when she spurned his advances. And maybe her killer was someone whose sexual advances she'd refused in the past. However, I consider it obvious that when Margaret's killer abducted her from the home, as indicated by the front door being ajar, it was clear that he intended to either sexually assault or kill her, or both. He abducted her with obviously violent intent, and at some point he tied her hands behind her back.
I think there's a strong theory for the sexual assault motive. I don't think they went in with that murderous intent just because the weapon seems to be a weapon of opportunity.
Yeah, I do think they might have been kind of winging it in a way, and I do think that they may have impulsively killed her. They may have intended only to rape her. That's my opinion.
That being said, that does lead me to believe it's probably a relatively inexperienced murderer and somebody that this isn't their norm. It doesn't give off a very serial killer vibe unless it's them starting a pattern.
I suspect that her killer may have been young, inexperienced, and that this may have been the start of a pattern. We'll get to that. Now, as for the lack of physical signs of penetrative sexual assault found by the medical examiner, as I mentioned earlier, it very well could be the case that her killer had planned to rape her, perhaps inside of their vehicle at that spot locally known as a lover's lane. It could also be the case, though, that Margaret fought back, or that she screamed, or that another vehicle approached, maybe even the vehicle of those kids who originally saw her body, or all or any of the above. What I'm getting at here is that something could have occurred to cause Margaret's killer to panic and fatally strike her with that rock, perhaps impulsively, before committing an act of penetrative sexual assault. A scream or the flash of approaching headlights could perhaps have been enough to cause her killer or killers to panic, kill her, and flee before carrying out their plan. As for whether or not her killer or killers was or were someone she knew, we simply don't know. We do know, though, again, it is statistically true that most murdered women and teen girls are killed by someone they know, often a man in their life. So this possibility does have significant statistical heft behind it and certainly shouldn't be discounted. However, Margaret wasn't the only young woman murdered in Tucson around this time, not even close. And that makes me wonder whether maybe something more may have been going on, whether there may have been a serial predator active in the area at the time, or more accurately, more than one serial predator. It's a theory that investigators have considered and that I personally find plausible. More on that next. Imagine you're walking through the park one day and you see a suspicious backpack sitting underneath a bench. You report it to the police, and upon investigating, they discover 2 live pipe bombs inside. You rush to clear the area before they explode, saving countless lives and preventing injury. Everyone declares you a hero for a fleeting moment until everything changes and you are declared the prime suspect. This was the story of security guard Richard Jewell. After the Centennial Park bombing killed 1 person and wounded more than 100, public pressure and a media witch hunt pushed a desperate FBI to find a suspect. Despite obvious holes in the case, the FBI tried to get Jewell to confess by using unethical means. In the newest season of Generation Y, the Olympic Park bombing, hosts Aaron and Justin explore the aftermath of the 1996 Centennial Olympic Park bombing. Listen as they delve into the details of the case, the sway of public opinion, and the identity of the real killer, who after a years-long manhunt was apprehended through pure luck and was found to be responsible for other bombings across the United States. Follow Generation Y, the Olympic Park bombing on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to Generation Y early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus. And now, back to Margaret's story. As we've discussed, 15-year-old Margaret was abducted from her home, bound at the wrists, murdered, and abandoned in the desert on the outskirts of Tucson in April of 1982. Crimes like this are rare, but in Tucson in the 1980s, they weren't as rare as you would probably assume, or at least hope. Now, it's worth mentioning here that this wasn't just a Tucson or Arizona problem, really. Murder rates peaked in the U.S. as a whole in 1980, so we're talking about a particularly violent era in American history. There's a reason why so many serial killer documentaries harken back to the 80s. It was a lot easier to get away with things back then, which led to more serial offenders. And we've certainly covered cases like Margaret's before. For example, in a previous episode, we covered the unsolved homicide of Diana Vicari, a 19-year-old Tucson woman who was murdered in 1992. Her partial remains were discovered in a dumpster, and at the time of this recording, her killer still has yet to be identified. While researching this episode, I looked into a variety of similar crimes where people, particularly girls and women, were killed in Tucson. There were a lot of them. In most cases, I found that the offenders responsible, in the cases where the offenders were known anyway, weren't in the area when Margaret was murdered. Many of them were living elsewhere or incarcerated at the time. What I did find, though, as I read through newspaper archives, was lots of other cases from the Tucson area, each just as tragic as Margaret's, and the majority of them are still unsolved. One 1997 Arizona Daily Star article by Heather Urquidez alone named 6 other murdered children whose parents all belonged to the same support group. At the time, that group was called Tucson's Parents of Murdered Children. It was the charter chapter of an organization that still exists and is now known as Homicide Survivors Incorporated. When it comes to those original 6 cases mentioned in the article alongside Margaret's, I checked for updates and found that all of them are still unsolved. Margaret was neither the first nor the last person, or even the first or last child, to be murdered and abandoned in the foothills on the edges of Tucson. It's obvious that there were multiple predators operating in the area in the 80s. Many of them remain nameless to this day, but not all. And when it comes to the named predators, one in particular stands out, not least of all because he was publicly named by investigators as a suspect in Margaret's murder.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yes, his name was William Fred Garrison, and he was a Tucson serial rapist. At the time of Margaret's death, he was 21 years old, and according to a 1982 article for the Arizona Republic, he was considered to be one of several potential suspects in regards to Margaret's murder almost immediately. Scott, as you probably recall, Margaret was abducted and murdered on April 8, 1982.
Yes.
Well, that same year, William Fred Garrison committed 2 rapes in Tucson, one occurring on April 14th and the other on May 14th. Both of his victims were local women. That's according to an article for the Arizona Republic. Now, I wanted to know more about the nature of Garrison's crimes, whether they bore any similarities to the attack against Margaret. So I did some more digging, and I found some other newspaper articles from that year that told me exactly what I wanted to know. Scott, according to an article published in the Arizona Daily Star, also in the spring of 1982, Garrison wasn't just charged with rape. He was also charged with second-degree burglary and kidnapping.
Okay.
Now, when most people think of burglary, they think of someone sneaking into a house or business in order to steal. However, the term actually represents something much broader than that. Legally speaking, all burglary really refers to is the act of making unlawful entry into a building with the intent of committing a crime, and that crime doesn't have to be theft.
No, it can be any crime.
Right, under Arizona law, specifically, second-degree burglary is defined as unlawfully entering a dwelling with the intent to commit either theft or any type of felony crime. So if an offender unlawfully enters someone's home in Arizona to sexually assault them, that's also burglary. There doesn't need to be any element of theft involved. As for kidnapping, well, it can refer to the act of taking someone to a secondary location by force or threat, or it can refer simply to the act of holding someone against their will. So if an offender refused to allow someone to leave their own home, for example, that would also be considered kidnapping. And that's exactly what happened when it came to Garrison's 2 known attacks. For example, during the May 14th attack, he entered his 26-year-old victim's home at night while she was sleeping, at 12:45 a.m. to be exact. When she awoke, he had his hands on her throat and threatened both her and her children who were also present in the home. He then bound her wrists and sexually assaulted her. Many elements of that crime sound familiar, don't they?
Yeah, they do. There's just a few differences there that make it not so clear-cut.
Right. Now, when it comes to the similarities, Garrison carried out the May 14th attack at 12:45 a.m. We know that Margaret was taken from her home at some point between 11 p.m. and 1:30 a.m., so that fits the time window just right. We also know that Margaret's killer showed up at her home and possibly threatened her in order to force her to comply with her own abduction. And of course, we know that Margaret's killer bound her wrists. They were still bound when her body was discovered just hours later. And the May 14th assault occurred about 5 weeks after Margaret's murder. We also know that Garrison committed another rape, that one on April 14th, so just a week after Margaret's murder. And that crime was very similar to the other. According to an article published in the Arizona Daily Star, the victim of the April 14th attack awoke that night to find Garrison standing in her bedroom holding a knife. He threatened her, then tore up a nearby macrame plant holder and used the resulting rope to tie her wrists together before gagging and sexually assaulting her. And there we see the impulsive use of materials that are at hand, that is, the plant holder. He tore that down and he used that to tie her up, perhaps similarly to how he may have picked up a rock and impulsively struck Margaret with it.
One of the things that is still standing out to me is the time between the attacks. If he was responsible for Margaret's, I would be very interested to see if there were any others within that April 14th to May 14th time, because that's going from a very short cooldown period to a very long one.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I actually have a thought on the matter. Yes, it looks sort of like a 1-week cooldown period and then moving on to a month-long cooldown period, but here's the thing. If our theory is correct, he did not get to complete the sexual assault that he had planned to commit against Margaret. So he didn't get to finish the crime. There was no cooling down. He was still looking for a victim, which may be why just a week later he attacked another victim, who he did successfully sexually assault, and he may have been content for the following month before committing another crime.
Okay, that kind of answers my second thing, which was how those two attacks were very predominantly sexual assaults.
Yes.
Margaret's bore no physical evidence, which would lead me to think that he was probably interrupted if that was the case.
Mm-hmm.
My last real thought that I have right now with this particular set of incidences is with the other two awakening to him being in the home already. That sounds like it was probably forced entry.
I'm glad you brought that up because I do have a little bit more information on that point. Now, the April 14th assault, the one he committed just a week after Margaret's death. I know that he did not force entry into that home, and here's why. He had a spare key because his mom was the landlord to that house.
Okay.
So that's how he got in. He was able to noiselessly enter the house with the spare key while the victim was sleeping. Now, the assault that occurred a month later in May, I actually don't know how he made entry into that home. I don't know if he forced his way in or if he found an unlocked door or window. I wasn't able to locate that information. So overall, Scott, it sounds like you're wondering, as I am, whether it's possible that Garrison abducted Margaret with the intent of sexually assaulting her and that he panicked for some reason and struck her over the head with a rock, killing her before actually committing the assault that he'd intended to.
When you said that, something just clicked in my mind, which would also change why he would go from sexually assaulting her at a secondary location to sexually assaulting victims in a primary location. Because if he was interrupted when he tried to do it at a secondary location and this really enraged him to the point where he wasn't gratified and didn't get that gratification, he might have thought, well, from now on, I'm just going to do it in the home where nobody will happen upon me or interrupt me.
I do think that's very plausible. He might have watched those victims. He might have stalked them some prior to attacking. Now, in the case of the April attack, he definitely knew who lived in that house and what the routine was like because the mom was the landlord. He would have known whether or not that victim had a partner who was in the house with her. I think it's very plausible that, as you suggested, he may have learned from that experience. That may be why he had chosen to assault future victims in their own homes, away from the eyes of passers-by, skittering coyotes or headlights or whatever may have spooked him.
Exactly.
I think that his involvement is a very plausible theory, and obviously investigators did too, because they publicly named him as a potential suspect. They did not publicly name anyone else. He may very well still be considered a potential suspect. I don't know. It's been decades since Margaret's case has made the news or been publicly acknowledged by law enforcement. And if Garrison did kill Margaret Scott, he may have drawn inspiration from close to home, particularly when it came to binding her wrists and taking her out into the foothills.
Is this a pattern that he learned from his father?
Close. A brother. I say this because just half a dozen years beforehand, Garrison's brother, Bobby Joe Garrison, sexually assaulted and murdered a woman named Verna Marie Martin. He bound her wrists, sexually assaulted her, fatally strangled her, and left her body to be discovered in the desert on the outskirts of Tucson. Sounds kind of familiar, right?
Given the fact that you have two brothers within the same family doing these aggressive sexual assaults, it leaves me with a lot of questions about what their home life was and how much of this is like some sort of genetic predisposition.
Who's to say, how much is nature and how much is nurture? I don't think science has really figured it out, but I have a lot of questions about the parents, especially the mom who either gave or left accessible to her son a spare key to her female tenant's home, knowing what her other son had already done. Now, to be clear, by the time Margaret was killed, Bobby Joe Garrison was already in prison serving a life sentence for that murder, so there's no possibility of him being involved in Margaret's death. However, there does exist the possibility that his younger brother, William Garrison, might have considered his methods when deciding how to commit his own possible first crime. So, one thing you're probably wondering, Scott, is where Garrison lived at the time of all these crimes.
I am.
Well, like Margaret, he lived in eastern Tucson, the 5800 block of East 23rd Street to be specific. If you look at a map, you'll see that his home was located 5 blocks due south of Margaret's home on North Woodland Avenue, so not a long distance at all. An 8-minute drive up Craycroft Road is all it would have taken to get from his home to hers. Less, if you're willing to disregard the speed limit. And here's another thing, Scott. You know the rape Garrison committed on April 14th, just a week after Margaret's murder?
Yeah.
Well, according to an article published in the Arizona Republic, Garrison threatened the victim of that assault by telling her, quote, "Be quiet, or you'll end up like the girl at the end of Craycroft Road," end quote.
I kind of have mixed feelings about that. That was obviously something that was probably pretty popular and reported on pretty well at the time and could have been a significant threat.
Yes, it may imply guilt to a certain degree, but you're right. Most people had probably heard about this on the news at the time, and most people would have known about it. It certainly doesn't prove anything, but it's concerning.
He could have been piggybacking on somebody else's to bolster his own threat or try to inflate his own image in their eyes.
It's possible, yeah, but that piece of information certainly got investigators' attention.
As it should.
Ultimately, Garrison was convicted of sexual assault and sentenced to 14 years in prison. That's according to an article published in the Tucson Citizen in the fall of 1982. Garrison, who's 63 years old at the time of this recording, has never been charged with any crime in relation to Margaret's death. No one has, for that matter. And while there are numerous reasons to be suspicious of Garrison, remember this. Investigators stated that he was just one of several potential suspects. It's possible that someone else, someone just as depraved, was prowling Tucson in the spring of 1982 and was responsible for Margaret's murder. Garrison certainly wasn't the only predator active in Tucson at the time. One of the newspaper articles I referenced even mentions a different, possibly random sexual assault that occurred around that time that isn't believed to be connected to Margaret's case or to any of Garrison's crimes. As for Margaret's case, it remains unsolved and seems to have been forgotten by modern media. Almost all of the details of Margaret's story presented in this episode came from old newspaper archives, and the one relatively recent news article I was able to locate is already nearly 20 years old. But for those who loved Margaret, the many years since her death are years they've had to live without her and without answers. At the time of Margaret's murder, her mom, Judy, told the Arizona Daily Star, quote, "Someone took my world. I don't know who did it. I don't know why they did it. She was my best friend." End quote. If you know anything about the murder of Margaret Carabetta, please call the Tucson Police Department at 520-791-4444, or use the online tip form, which we've linked to in this episode's show notes and on our website. And if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved homicide of Diana Vicari. Her and Margaret's cases aren't related, to the best of my knowledge, but both were Tucson teens who were murdered within just a few years of each other. Both of their cases remain unsolved.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Instagram and Twitter at LSA Podcast and our new TikTok, Last Seen Alive Podcast. New episodes of Last Seen Alive go live every other Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Margaret's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our new merch store where you can get an LC t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.